So the idea of printing a human cells for a heart to print human cells for any organ is already going on. In fact, printing skin cells is already done as a technology for grafting burn victims rather than just ripping skin off from some other part of your body. That seems crazy, right?
Mark Mills is a technology forecaster, engineer, investor, physicist, and the executive director of the National Center for Energy Analytics. Mark Mills is also the author of The Cloud Revolution: How the Convergence of New Technologies Will Unleash the Next Economic Boom and a Roaring 2020s, which is the focus of today's podcast. Thank you, Mark Mills, for joining us today.
Great to be on your show. I'm excited to talk about the prospect of a roaring 2020s eventually. Not talk about it eventually, but see it roar eventually.
Most people are familiar with the cloud, the phrase the cloud, but it's, someone uses their smartphone and hears about cloud computing. It just seems like it's all virtual, and the cloud makes it sound like it's just up in the skies, whatever. Right. So what exactly is the cloud for people that are unfamiliar with cloud computing?
Yeah, there's no specific definition, as you know. This is the trouble with popularizing an infrastructure. But it's an infrastructure. The way it's like saying, what's a highway system? And you to describe there's got to have roads and bridges and access roads. You make it out of asphalt. I mean, you could go through intuitively, what transportation means. But if you said intermodal transportation, then that word's an alien word. It means go from ship to truck and truck to train. Then the system gets much bigger and more complex. The transportation system is very big and complex. Our cloud system is a communications, a compute system, and it's big and complex. But the simple thing is, you used to call this in the early days of computing remote compute. You could have a computer that was remote that you could access with a teletype, not the kind of devices we have today. You had remote terminals in a computer somewhere else in a building or in a different building. It was connected literally by wires at that time. The cloud today, obviously, is the integration of three things: centralized data centers that are typically the size of a Walmart, right? Massive warehouse scale buildings full of compute, as well as memory and routing. So you route, compute, do things in that building. You need communications connections between those buildings and the users, whether it's an inanimate user like a machine or a human. And so that's wired, typically fiberglass, fiber optics these days, glass fiber, but also wireless, the cellular networks that we are all intimately familiar with. And of course, end-use devices are part of the cloud, whether it's the sensor. Your GPS is a sensor, tells you where you are. A camera is a sensor, right? There's a location, the visual location. All kinds of sensors exist in your phone and outside of your phone. Those sensors and what you do with the screen are the third element of the cloud. So those three things together constitute what makes it possible is, everybody takes for granted, which is like mapping, right? Or Airbnb or Uber. But that requires the integration of those three features: the sensor, where am I? Where's the counterparty? Then there's a cloud compute and integration function trying to guess through AI and all that data, marrying counterparties, marrying them economically. I want this, I can provide that. It's true in business as well. So short story is compute analysis primarily residing in a remote data center, some compute analysis on the edge, your devices, whether it's you or inanimate, and of course linking them all. As a physical infrastructure, I argue in my book, it's the biggest physical infrastructure humanity's ever built, and it's still growing fast. It's at a phenomenal in scale by every measure.
I was reading a 2013 article that you wrote called "The Clouds Began with Coal." Yeah. In this article, that's over a decade old, you basically say that if you watch an hour of video or streaming video on your phone, that is the equivalent of about two refrigerators of electricity for that hour in terms of cloud computing. And this, of course, is way before AI. But basically, the smartphone was what even possible just because, when you're on an app or whatever, you're basically cloud computing, right? You're not actually using the processing power of that phone. The processing power of the phone is just using the app, and then the app is using the cloud.
Yeah. Well, there's a interrelationship. There's a lot of phone functions that take place native in the phone, right? And there's a lot of phone functions that are, as you say, are simply a way of mediating what you're asking for doing with the cloud compute. And it varies, depends on the app, what you're doing, but it's a dynamic relationship. But the heavy lifting is in the cloud, because you can do a lot more heavy duty compute power in a massive facility than you can in a little handheld. But that's exactly right. And what I did then is I had, and there was a reason for the provocative title, "The Cloud Begins with Coal," because what I was pointing out is the obvious, that everything in the compute infrastructure, communicate, uses electricity somewhere, somehow. So it has to be plugged in. If you have a battery, you plugged it in to charge it. You have to replug it in. Most stuff isn't battery powered, can't be, because the energy use is too great, too continuous. So if you look at your pro rata, your personal share of cloud compute and your personal share of the energy used by cloud communications and compute, what you learn is that for a person who uses the phone the way you described, an hour or two of video, watching a Major League Baseball, watching a movie, then using in the apps, then your electricity use that's remote from your device is roughly equal to the refrigerator in your kitchen. And so it doesn't matter how you measure it. If the refrigerator's hours worth of electricity is roughly equal to an hour's worth of phone use, but you'd use the phone peaks and valleys, not at night much, in the daytime more. So it's more accurate to just look at the yearly average is what I did, as opposed to, because you can look at just the energy you use while you're Zooming, while you're using video like we are now. That's the highest energy cost use of the internet until AI. Now, when you layer AI on top of it, you accelerate the energy use, because AI in energy terms is roughly the difference between, racing a car, running it flat out a 24-hour, say, marathon, versus driving your car episodically as you need it from your garage. But yeah, and it was a provocative calculation. It caused a reaction from Apple back then. They issued a global press release to say that I was wrong. When you charge your phone, it uses no more electricity than a baby's nightlight, which is true. That's not where the energy is primarily used. The energy is used in making the phone in the first place. Phones are consumable, as we all know. They have limited life, not just because they're built to fail, it's because technology advances enough that your phone's utility degrades rapidly still. So the energy embodied in making the phone matters, just like it does in everything. Then, of course, the networks use a lot of energy. Roughly speaking, the networks use as much energy as the data centers, which is kind of interesting. So the transport of bits back and forth is a big energy consumer. And sending information wirelessly is more energy intensive than in a fiber cable. For the same reason, simplistically, that if you wanted to transport water, using a hose with a sprinkler to get water in a bucket is a lot less efficient than using a pipe, right? Phones tend to be like sprinklers, because that's what the airwaves are sort of the visual equivalent of. So in that report, as you saw, I also made an observation and a forecast about the global electricity use of the cloud as a percentage of all electricity in absolute kilowatt hour terms. And at that time, there were a lot of electric vehicles already in the world. Elon Musk had already brought us the Tesla S, global electricity use for EVs. And I forecasted based on extant data to the year 2024. I got the forecast very accurate. I mean, I did pretty good. Not because I was a genius. In the book, I used the line, you only, and I stole this from the management consultant, Peter Drucker, you only forecast what's already happened. Sounds like a silly thing to say. It's like saying the sun's going to rise tomorrow. It's a pretty reliable forecast. And then there's a spectrum of that all the way towards things that haven't happened, that might happen, and you're really guessing. So there's a continuum. But when it comes to technology, you can make pretty accurate forecasts on a lot of things based on what we know how to build, because the velocity of change is slower than most people realize. You refresh apps quickly, but the underlying hardware has predictable characteristics of what we know how to build over the coming decade. So the rate of improvement of efficiency of compute, for example, is pretty predictable. It gets better fast. And then what you're trying to then predict is a countervailing thing, is the rate of increase in demand for the product service, which is bits being transported and processed. Those are relatively predictable, a little less predictable because it's human behavior, but we have a lot of data on that. And so you can predict that energy demand was going to go up because demand for the bits is going up faster than the efficiency of processing and moving the bits. So I forecasted then that the global cloud by 2024 would use 10 times more electricity than all the global EVs on the planet. There's about 20 million EVs in the world today. And that's about where we are. It's your smartphone, which is the dominant use of the cloud. The global use of smartphones uses 10 times more electricity than the global use of electric cars, which is kind of it gives you sort of a framing for the magnitude of the physical call on resources, electricity and materials that the cloud represents.
Let's pull your title of the book apart a little bit more before we start diving into this, but the full title of your book is The Cloud Revolution, How the Convergence of New Technologies Will Unleash the Next Economic Boom in a Roaring 2020s. And basically the Roaring 2020s, the 1920s were also, of course, called the Roaring 1920s, which is where I assume you got that terminology from, right?
You got it right.
And so let's just take a look at a few of the inventions from the 1920s. So in 1920, we had the first licensed commercial radio broadcasting station. In 1921, insulin was isolated, and on January of 1922, the first person received insulin for treatment for diabetes. Yeah. 1923, we had the first electric automated traffic signal. Yeah. 1925 was the first central air conditioning system, not air conditioning, but central air conditioning. 1927 was the first success of the home refrigeration unit, and Freon was invented the year after. Television was first demonstrated in San Francisco in 1927 as well. Yep. 1928, something called penicillin was discovered. And one of the biggest analogies or expressions ever, sliced bread was first sold on July 7th, 1928.
Yeah. That's hence the expression, right?
Hence the expression, right? And so, you're basically comparing the 2020s to the Roaring 1920s, and there's obviously significantly more inventions, but I just kind of highlighted a few.
And the commercial aviation at that time, that was the rise of the automobile. It began in the 20s. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
And you're right. What you find when you sort of poke at history, which is made easy by Google, the cloud, you can ask questions, and it's even easier now that they use AI, because AI helps the non-AI side do its search. Not to digress, but as I'm sure you know, AI emerges from essentially the idea that we wanted semantic web. We wanted the internet search function and our ability to use computers to adapt to our natural way of speaking, and as opposed to us being forced to type in the language a computer would understand. And the computers are so stupid, I have to be very specific. You teach children to understand context. So when you tell them something, they get context, right? Computers don't get context until AI. The whole point of AI is to give context to the query and for the computer to do the right thing in context, like search. Anyway, I digress. That's why it's magical. It's why computer scientists have thought about doing this and known about doing this for decades. Why there's a lot about AI in my book, which was published before ChatGPT was unveiled, but not before we've been doing a lot of work in AI. But back to your question. So 1920s was one of those points in history, which occur very rarely, when there's this huge confluence of all kinds of things happening. And so what you want to sort of unbundle, what was going on? I mean, what was the underlying phenomenology? Because there's been lots of inventions throughout history, but it's when you get a confluence of inventions in different domains that occur simultaneously that really get big changes in economies and technology. Because there's nothing happens in isolation. There's always cross-fertilization, right? Both in terms of the engineering and intellectual property, but also the business function, right? Sears and Roebuck was the Amazon of its day. Sears used the railroad system to distribute things, cheap paper, which they didn't invent, to distribute catalogs, and the telegraph, right, to coordinate communications. Those three things happened simultaneously, give or take a few years. It made possible something revolutionary in commerce at that time. Sears had a 1 century run, pretty good. Amazon did not invent the cloud, the internet, right? GPS or trucks. But if you think what Amazon is as an online retailer, they took advantage of the confluence of several things that were not invented by Jeff Bezos. The 1920s, what I did is, my book is I divide the kinds of technology revolutions into three magisteria, 3 spheres. There's the machines that we use to do things, cars, trucks, power plants, airplanes, the things that allow you to manufacture and move. Those are machines. Then we have materials that we access to make things from or do things with, which through most of human history, it's, natural stuff, wood and stone and leather. But in the 1920s, we had the advent of polymers and pharmaceuticals, high-strength steel. All these things made a difference. You couldn't make an airplane without aluminum. The Wright brothers' principal invention wasn't the airfoil that had been around, is they figured out the engine was too heavy. So they made an aluminum block engine. They were originally going to start an engine company because they thought their principal insight was a lightweight engine, which it was, made the airplane possible. So you have the machine domain, the materials domain, then you have, broadly speaking, the information domain, how you can access and process and store information, whether that's the development of mathematics, whether it's the invention of the radio, whether it's the invention of a typewriter or a calculator. These are all information-centric things. If you trace history, there's been revolutions, if you like, inventions, at each of those at different times. In the 1920s, we had profound revolutions in all 3 simultaneously. To your point, the radio and telephone, by the way, which you didn't mention, took off in the 1920s. So we had the advent of the professionalization of science in the 1920s. The idea of R&D didn't exist prior to then at all. There was no professionalization of science at the macro level until the early 20th century, blossoming in the 1920s. And we had communications things that were revolutionary, the telephone as well as the demonstration of TV, but more importantly, radio, which was a big deal. It was like the radio of that time was the internet of our day, literally. And RCA stock, which brought the radio to the masses, rose something like 10,000% in 6 years from the introduction of the first radio to the 6 years later. You become a billionaire in modern terms if you buy RCA stock. So you had information revolution. And the machine revolutions were several things going on simultaneously. The car itself became practical for millions of people. Although there'd already been cars by 1920, there'd been automobiles for 30 years and hundreds of automobile companies. But it took the confluence of other things simultaneously to get the mass production line, like the famous Henry Ford line. Synthetic rubber had to be invented to make the car practical. You had to make gasoline because batteries were terrible then, worse than they are now. But they were useful because first cars were electric, in fact, with lead acid batteries. You also had aviation begin, and you had mass production beginning. Those are all machine-centric revolutions. Each of them took place independent of the other ones, but they all happened to occur at the same time. And so what that did is caused a increase in capabilities to do things like make air conditioning possible, by the way. That was the chemical revolution combined with the electric revolution, combined with the information insight of the Carnot principles for compression and expansion of gases to move heat. That's an information insight combined with an infrastructure insight that didn't exist before, electric motor that can make a compressor, and a chemical insight, which was freon gas, which you need as a particular type of chemical to make a heat pump move heat from A to B. Those are 3 different domains. The people that did the inventions of those domains had nothing to do with each other in terms of their businesses, in terms of their education, in terms of where they were in the world, but they happened contemporaneously. That caused the biggest economic expansion in human history from 1920 to the year 2000. It improved the real wealth of Americans by 700%. I mean, the average per capita income in inflation-adjusted terms exploded. As you know, as I point into my book, that doesn't mean that we didn't do stupid stuff like have wars. 2 horrific global wars took place in the 20th century, obviously. A lot of bad people, a lot of bad things. Soviet Union came into being. We had the destruction of a great economy, 70 years of the Soviet Empire. Those things happen they don't not happen because we invent magic technologies. I mean, we're humans. So I try to make the clear difference in my book between the radical opportunities created by technologists and engineers and scientists, and whether or not they actually are realized quickly to benefit humans more than harm them is a political issue and a human nature issue. I mean, overall, humans have done better over time, but we haven't become saints and perfect and stopped warring. So I just want to context that point of the incredible expansion, the efflorescence of human well-being, the destruction of poverty, the destruction of starvation. People still starve in the world. It's not because we can't make enough food. It's because of politics and people. My point in the book, of course, is I'm claiming that we are experiencing right now a revolution comparable in character in the three same spheres. In the information sphere, the revolution that's going on is the cloud itself. This is an unprecedented infrastructure of democratization of supercompute function for everybody. The fact that billions of people have access to such incredible compute power practically for free. It's so common, it's taken for granted. It's a staggering change. I mean, any human on the planet is what, 4 billion cell phones in the world today? I mean, we're pushing half of the human population has access to incredible near infinite compute power. This is unprecedented in so many ways. So the information revolution occurred so quasi-independently from the fact that we also have contemporaneously a machine revolution. It's not the invention of airplanes or rockets; those have been around for a long time. But the principal vector of a machine revolution right now is in the scale at which we can manufacture things. We now manufacture a molecular scale and even atomic scale. And that takes a long time to mature, just like mass production took a long time to mature. That's unprecedented. Allows precision to make things, not just transistor chips, in ways that are just unprecedented and remarkable in history. And also we have maybe the most important revolution is automation, robotics. We're now moving to an era of true automation, true mobile robotics, if you like, disconnected from being bolted down. Most automation, physical automation, has been physically tethered to the ground, to something. And of course, the third revolution is in the material science domain, which gets the least attention because it's as soon as you say the words material science, I think people glaze over like, oh, boring. But making materials that exhibit properties that don't exist in nature, so-called metamaterials that can cause phenomena equivalent to invisibility, if you like, is no longer science fiction. It's done. The revolutions in biocompatible materials, allowing us to implant things in the human body that aren't rejected by your body, that have native intelligence. This is no longer science fiction. There are FDA-approved materials that allow us to make consumable, to put it in simplistic terms, consumable, not just implantable compute and sensors. This is as consequential as the development of pharmaceuticals in the first place. So we have smart materials, self-healing materials, new classes of alloys and aerogels that exhibit structural strength equal to steel, but weigh as much as foam. That's why they call aerogels. Crazy stuff going on in material science that is underappreciated because it's not, quote, compute science, which is where all the hype is. It's not that the hype isn't deserved in compute science and AI. It's that the others ignored. What I'm trying to point out in my book is when you have all three revolutions happen again simultaneously in the same spheres, materials, machines, information, you can only predict some of the consequences, but you could, that on a specific basis, but you can predict confidently on a macro basis there will be lots of consequences from that kind of confluence. By that I mean economic consequences, the new kinds of companies and services that don't exist today.
So your book, I believe, was published in 2021, which would have been, is that correct?
Well, yeah, right at the end of the year. So technically speaking, if you look at the pub date and release date, it was essentially a January 2022 book, but it's 2.5 years old. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you published it basically about a year or so-ish before ChatGPT, of course, came out, which, yeah, that obviously has been pretty, and not just ChatGPT, but all the other products that integrate and use that technology, or LLMs. And in the book, you talk about some pretty futuristic things that are pretty hard to believe. For me, the most futuristic, far out one is 3D printing hearts or other organs. Since we're We're August 2024, so we're a little over at the halfway point of 2024. So you still have well over 5 years left of this decade. What are things that you expect to see right now that will be, maybe if not ubiquitous, will be at least out there, not just in theory, but currently developed before the end of this decade?
But, again, I just say, as you know, I'll say again that all of the technologies that I map out in the book, and I try to frame the logic by treating each domain independently, the machines, the materials, the information, then integrate them to look at implications in tourism, healthcare, manufacturing, and education, because those are the things that we care about. And I don't put anything in there that's a forecast based on my ideas of something that would be nice to happen or could happen. Everything that's in the book has already happened. So the idea of printing the human cells for a heart, to print human cells for any organ, is already going on. In fact, printing skin cells is already done as a technology for grafting burn victims rather than just ripping skin off from some other part of your body. That seems crazy, right? But what has happened is again, the confluence of the machine, which we call a 3D printer, but it just basically means it's like your 2D printer is your computer printer, which prints, literally speaking, it prints in 3 dimensions, right? It has to have depth. There's a few microns of ink laid down, but it's basically a 2-dimensional printer, X and Y dimension, to give you ink. If you could keep printing the 3rd dimension up, you can make an object. That's why it's called 3D printing, as you know. But to make 3D printing work, you needed a lot more information, understanding about materials. You needed the machines to improve significantly. They have. And also you needed different classes of materials. Material science had to advance so that you could, in fact, do things like print organic tissue, human cells, which one can do. And we are on track to the idea of printing organ replacements for humans. You'll do the simple organs first, right? The skin is the simplest organ. So that's not science fiction. Now, the question you have, if you're an analyst for an investment fund, you wonder, where do I invest? When will it happen? How will it benefit me? The trajectory from something that can be done to something that becomes commercially viable to something that becomes commercially ubiquitous is something else I map out of my book that hasn't changed in a century. It's, roughly speaking, each of those steps is 10 years. So from invention of an idea to some possibility of commercial viability is typically a decade. The lithium battery is a good example. It's a material science invention, late 70s. It was invented initially at Exxon Labs and then separately at University of Texas, the idea of it. It wasn't until the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, 10 years later, there were lithium batteries that could be used anywhere. Very expensive, only for small devices. To begin to be significant in commercial market insertion, cheap enough, reliable enough, safe enough, took another 10 years of engineering. And that was in the early 2000s when Elon Musk decided he could use them to make cars. And then from that point to significant commercial adoption, not insertion, it took another decade, right? It wasn't until well into 2020 roughly that you saw a lot of EVs, a lot of Teslas. That's true for pharmaceuticals. That's true for new classes of steel. It's true for new classes of computer, but I mean new classes, not. So I try to differentiate that in the book so that we're not dealing in science fiction, in that in the 2020s, what you'd expect to see happen is some products emerge that say this is a real thing. So go back to where you started. If you saw the first commercial radios, which we did in the early 1920s, you didn't see commercial insertion until the mid-20s and significant adoption until the late 20s. So we're going to see more drones. So in my book, I write a lot about drones as one of the class of machines, not toy drones, but drones used for commercial purposes. They have gone from being interesting and being tried out to being pretty ubiquitous in a lot of industries. The insurance industry uses drones for it's the primary tool used to do surveys and analysis, whether it's for home insurance or disaster mapping. We use them for communications. We use them in war fighting now, like all technologies. They often get weaponized. That's maybe Ukraine war with Russia may be seen as the first drone war, or the first war where drones have been significantly deployed at scale and been effective. So that the fact that some things seem sort of crazy. I wrote a lot about AI in the book because before ChatGPT, there's a lot going on in AI. And I'm very optimistic, given what's already happened. We'll see very significant specific applications sectors for AI that will be profoundly useful. This is very different than artificial general intelligence, computers replacing humans, which I discount fundamentally. But more importantly, even if you believed getting closer as possible, it's going to take far, far longer than that gets you into science fiction land as opposed to predictable things that happen in the 20s. Flying cars, autonomous air taxis. We know how to build them. There's no longer speculative. There's at least 100 companies making air taxis that are both electric and hybrid, fueled and non-electric. Many of them will be piloted. Many of them will be autonomous. The autonomy takes more time because it's more complicated, difficult to certify and make safe. But it's not speculative. They're being built. Some of them are certified in other countries to already begin flight insertion. So the ramp, how fast they'll become useful, will be an infrastructure, an engineering and money issue, not is the technology possible issue. The same is true of the subject I probably spend more time on in my book than I should. And I wrote an earlier book called Work in the Age of Robots. The advent of automation in the form of anthropomorphic robots, C-3PO, Terminator style robots. That class of machine has been speculative for a long, long time. It's no longer speculative. There's at least, I'll use the number a dozen, but it's more than a dozen. There are a dozen high-profile companies, none of them public, all of which are now making an anthropomorphic robot that has high utility, and one has already got commercial insertion. This is Agility Robotics with their robot for warehouse use. And the reason you would make an anthropomorphic robot, of course, is to make autonomous machines help humans. The highest value is if they can work in our environment. We don't work in their caged environment. To work in our environment, they have to operate like we do because we don't have to build things for them to operate, like no ramps everywhere, no steps, no step overs in a submarine or a ship on the door. Not valves that a robot can turn rather than a human. We want the robot to adapt to us. Anthropomorphism is very difficult to affect. And untethered mobility, it's extremely difficult. It required advances in material sciences. Electric motors had to get smaller, more powerful, right? The batteries had to get better, more powerful. Vision systems had to get better, more powerful. AI had to get better to do dynamic navigation and not hurt people when you're moving, all those things. But the confluence of those things have all come together, not theoretically. We look around and we can count the companies and see the products that they're making that are either just pre-commercial or have just been inserted. And that, to me, is a demonstrable trigger, a provable trigger that you can now make a reliable forecast. There will be more of them. What's difficult to forecast is, will they get cheap enough, fast enough, to use a good, easy example, that you might have a job for which a robot would be useful to you. Let's say you're a small business contractor and you're short labor already in the construction trades. If you're in that business, you're short labor. You're in law enforcement, you're short labor. It's nice to have an anthropomorphic automation that could do, say, the most dangerous thing, rather than put a human in that risk, which is what the military develops it for, or the thing that's the drudgery task that frees me up to do the non-drudgery task, which is what we do with automation. And that's no longer theoretical. We're already using robots to some extent in law enforcement. This is typically for bomb defusing, but also looking if there's a hostage situation. You use drones and even the dog-like, the anthropomorphized robots to go in and look, or even in some cases carry non-lethal weapons to manage a situation. These are the early applications, but they're being done now. So again, you can say there'll be more. How many more? I guess in my book, I forecast that the mobile robot business, whether it's wheeled, flying, or walking, will be bigger than the automobile industry in the coming years. I think that's predictable because if you just think through in any business, at your daily life, how many cars can you use? Well, rich people have 3 cars. You have a toy car, you have your practical car, you might have your beater. But you're not going to typically have 4 or 5. Some people do, but the average is people sort of trend to 2 cars for a lot of reasons. But a car has a limited utility. It's a specific thing. The robots fall in a different category. You can imagine a utility function for robots where any given individual in any given kind of job might need not a car or a truck, but 5 robots for different tasks that they're performing for their work, especially in the physical trades, talking about those where we again we're short people and short skills. So it's, I think, calculable, improvable in the broad sense that it'll be a bigger industry than the automotive industry in due course. Does that take 20 years, 40 years? Well, I think it'll take decades, not few years. But will you see lots of robots in general use within the 2020s? Absolutely, it's already happening. It's a forecast it's already started. It started when I was writing my book, and it's continuing since I wrote my book because, again, I chose examples from printing human tissue to robotics to aviation to other classes of material science and uses of AI in research and in facilitating education and obviously in entertainment. I mean, the early applications for a lot of these things are places where there's lowest risk to humans, right? Entertainment, if you're, to use the old adage that's stuck with us, if you get blue screen death playing an immersive video game, it's not consequential. It sure is consequential if that AI is flying an air taxi. And so the level of reliability has to be an order of magnitude higher before we get insertion into the domains at the intersection of bits and atoms.
So let's say hypothetically that you had, say, like a junior or senior in high school, and they were asking you for advice, like, oh, should I go off to college? What major should I do? I mean, you talk about dirty jobs in the book, and I believe you said in the book that there's 50% more STEM majors than actual jobs, and that the STEM fields is something like 2% of all the jobs in the economy, which, as you mentioned multiple times, would be about the size of the agriculture sector. And, that, of course, is very automated as well, talking about having tractors that have already implemented self-driving and have GPS and telling you how to irrigate, precision farming, things like that. But, because I think the average person, how can they use this information? They want, like, how can they apply this to their everyday life? So I guess I'd be asking you for what advice you'd give, say, your son or daughter that was a senior in high school, and then give us some specific timelines.
Yeah, that's a important question, because when you make forecasts of any kind, you want, what's actionable and what do you do with the information? Well, part of the reason, by the way, I did the forecast is because I tried to counter the general narrative of two things, that we sort of got the peak innovation, and that most of the innovation is in silly things like gaming and invading our privacy and causing problems for people with social media and deep fakes. I mean, that's the sort of the general zeitgeist of our culture today. It feels negative, and I think this is a time to be optimistic, not unrealistic about the challenges and problems that we have, cultural, social, political, wars, but to be fundamentally optimistic about opportunities. If humans are great builders and creators. As you know, at the beginning of the book, I wrote that they reminded people that philosophers have talked about the phrase Homo sapien, humans think. Maybe it should be called Homo faber or Homo faber, humans fabricate, make. We're reflexively builders. We build things to improve our lives, to go beyond mere survival. That's it. We have the capacity to build things unprecedented in history. We should be profoundly optimistic. So that's why I wrote it that way. Now, if you thought about what does that mean for like stock markets, well, it really does. Timing really matters then, because NVIDIA is the hot stock of the AI era, deservedly. And when ChatGPT was announced, I was doing an investor cruise for Steve Forbes. He does these cruises, and it's part serious and part, I'm not being unkind, parlor game. Can we make investment advice that's actionable, to your point? And I said, this was an easy one. This was right after ChatGPT came out and before NVIDIA had the big run-up. So if you want to place one bet on the table, is NVIDIA. It's easy. And probably Amazon and Microsoft, the infrastructure people, but NVIDIA's it's the poster child for deserved reasons. Had a great run. We'll see how she does. Even if the stock collapses, it doesn't change the value of the chips or the sales of the company. So there's the sentiment part and the timing part. If you had said buy NVIDIA and hold 10 years ago, you look like a genius, but you'd have to wait a decade. So there's a lot of technologies that are implicit in my book for which the real recognition of their value in, say, stock market terms will be a decade. they're just not going to happen overnight. Doesn't mean that people might. A good example of the violation of that rule was 3D printing. When that was the first 3D printing companies were announced in the late 90s. This is roughly what happened. The stock prices when they went public soared, and then they collapsed later in the early 2000s. Why? Well, it's over expectation of how fast and hard it would be to make 3D printing ubiquitously useful. The 3D printing market's expanded dramatically. There's a lot more of it going on, a lot more companies, but the stock valuations got ahead of the delivery. It's nature of markets. The most important one for all of us personally with our families, kids and grandkids, is what do you do? I mean, if you thought, so what's in people's heads before I answer the question is this. I don't want to personally be in or have my family be in the buggy whip business at the dawn of the age of the automobile. That's what's in people's heads. And understandably, this is the the idea of the advent of any class of technology that obviates a job. You don't want to be the one whose job is taken away. Or if you're a student, you want to make sure you're not training to do a job that's not going to exist. And to give a calibration point, something like, this is mapped out by one economist, something like 60% of all the jobs that existed in the 1960s, the titles for jobs, don't exist today as jobs. They just don't exist. And yet we don't have an unemployment problem. So on a macro level, the disappearance of a certain class of job and the emergence of a new class of jobs doesn't mean that we're going to put people out of work, but it doesn't mean specific job functions go away. It's self-evident. There's no draftsman really anymore. When I started working in the semiconductor business, we had a room full of draftsmen who drew the circuits that were made, the photoliths. So what would you tell a student? I mean, I tell you what I told my kids, and what I tell when our grandkids are old enough, I'll tell them. Is first, I think it's really important to have a domain understanding for technology. So you should study some degree of familiarity matters. There's a lot of ways to get that. You don't have to have a degree in engineering to be familiar with technology and understand it. I think it's very important to have familiarity with history and politics. So I would, in the broad educational sense, my advocacy first starts with, you've just got to train young minds to be able to learn. Learning how to learn is what education is about. And then having fundamentals, which is the obvious, arithmetic and language skills, knowledge of history. This gives you the sort of the toolkit you need to be adaptable, because everything in life is about being resilient, because bad stuff will happen to us personally or to exogenous to our lives. So the advice sounds trite, but I think it's incredibly important. You have to work hard, do well, be broadly skilled at understanding how to learn. It doesn't matter what you learn to know how to learn. I mean, if you want to specialize in history or English or in biology or in electrical engineering, the specialization teaches you how to become specialized, but the broader education teaches you how to be flexible if your specialty requires adaptation. Now, the specific thing you're asking is a fact that I put in the book and talked about, written about many times. We're so preoccupied with technology, which means in our modern parlance, compute cloud, that is somehow the sense that engineers are the dominant job, or coders. And in fact, when it comes to coding, as I pointed there, the number of coders are sort of roughly order of magnitude the same as the number of ranchers in the country. I mean, there's not going to be lots more ranchers, and we're going to need ranchers. I love ranchers, but we're in the 21st century, and we're not going to need a lot more coders. You need skilled coders. We're going to keep needing them, but as a percentage of the workforce, it's going to stay small because you don't need that many in the first place. And secondly, the coding gets easier. We're using AI to amplify skilled coders, so it's just going to hyper differentiate that market to those who have top talent. Somebody who's interested in that, I heartily endorse them pursuing it. But the idea that we had, remember a few years ago, all the babbling about making sure everybody could be a coding for seniors, coding for kindergarten. Come on, this is silly. But understanding that code is a language and understand what it means and have that familiarity so it doesn't seem alien, really important. It doesn't mean you're going to become a coder. Broadly speaking, this is the fascinating part for most policymakers and parents thinking about what their children can use. I mean, we've always produced more engineers, and there's a market for them. Part of that is self-selection. A lot of people get an engineering degree of some kind and just, I don't want to be an engineer. And they do something else, whether it's medicine, law, drive a truck, don't care. But there's always been shortages of specific engineering domains episodically. Right now, there is a shortage of AI skilled engineers. That will end quickly, by the way, because everybody rushes into it. And the way you fix the problem is they overpay initially, and markets work. It takes a few years. Market gets flooded, and it'll renormalize. And it might take a whole cycle of 5 to 10 years. But if we're talking about our kids, it's important to keep that in your head, that cycle may have ended of the hype by the time you graduate with the degree, quote, AI. So when it comes to thinking about engineering specifically, my bias is the basics. If you were to study as a degree, not computing science. If you like computing science, go for it. But math, physics, chemistry, mechanical engineering, aeronautical engineering, the basics, these are universally applicable. An employer will see a person with a skill in electrical engineering or a skill in mechanical engineering, knowing they can teach them the code, or that the coding is going to be easy for the application. But you can't teach a coder ME very easily. You can teach an ME coding much more easily. So since that makes you, in my opinion, the student, the employee, more valuable, and that if you're that person, that gives you negotiating power and gives you flexibility. But we're seeing the inverse in schools. We're seeing lots and lots of students study business, for example. The most popular degree is business. I mean, I don't want to, a really smart person studies business, will get a job. This is no knock on high performers. But on average, most employers don't need somebody with a business major. They need somebody who can show up, is smart, can be trained on the specifics of their business, because every business is a little different. If you want to be an accountant, that's very, very specific. The world needs lots of accountants. It's not being fully replaced by automation, but it will eventually be a decrease in accounting workforce, just like in the legal workforce, because automation on AI helps. So what does it say? It's a long answer to, if you've got kids and if they lean towards engineering or science at all, it's their reflexes. I'd love to encourage that. But if they're not leaning that way, what you don't want to do is have them think that they don't have an opportunity to be successful in life without being a coder or an engineer. Google did a study, which I cited in my book. There's been others like this, when they looked at the most successful employees that they had that ended up being promoted up the management chain, and they were overwhelmingly non-engineering majors. What they discovered was all the soft skills mattered more in terms of their ultimate success of those employees. So if you're in the employer and they look at what those soft skills, what that meant was they knew how to work, they knew how to get along with people, they knew how to manage their time, they knew how to listen, they knew how to make decisions. But these are sort of life skills that you learn in part at school, because that's the first time when you leave sort of the cloistered home life in high school and you're on your own thinking about how to manage your time. So it clearly mattered less that they weren't engineers, but they need their engineers, obviously, right? You can't run their cloud system without engineers. But here's the kicker. About a third of the population have a graduate degree, post-high school degree. Only a third are university or college educated. About half of the citizenry gets a college degree now. Not everybody. And I would suspect the half will decline slightly. I think we may have reached peak college degree in a sense, because most jobs don't require what most people learn at college. Most of what's required is, you're reasonably smart, you're honest, and you're hardworking, and you have a capacity and appetite to learn, and employers will teach you. So that's sort of the problem. But the skilled trades, I'm extremely bullish on young men and young women who, when they finish high school, really aren't, they're not academically driven. I mean, I like to figure out how things worked, because that was just sort of wired in me. It wasn't my parents' program, but I also liked so I'd like to learn and study the science, but I also was a mechanic, a machinist. I worked in construction. I liked building things with my hands. I mean, I really enjoyed it, learned to weld. It animated me. And if you're good at those kinds of things, the prospects for making a great salary are never been better, because that whole sector is being hollowed out by the average age of the employees with skilled trades, whether they're big companies or they're on their own. And our population is not growing as fast as our demand for people with, not talking about, pure labor, which is where you start. I did that in college, but skilled trades, whether it's electrician or plumber or machinist, those businesses can pay extremely well, are possible to get there with far less expense and debt than in most colleges. And the world needs people like that are smart and skilled. So this is great. And it gives people lifestyle choices that are different than an office job. It also gives you a trajectory towards starting businesses. Some of the most common successful millionaires in the country are not people who did coding. They're the famous ones. The most common ones, the so-called Millionaire Next Door, which is a book written by a Forbes colleague, are people who started a local plumbing business because they were a good plumber and they hired another associate and they just expanded, or electricians or carpenters. And they do extremely well creating businesses that provide a product or service the world's going to continue to need. Robots aren't going to replace that labor. They're going to amplify it. They're going to make it possible to pay the skilled trades more, because the benefit of the automations, this has always been true throughout history, is to allow the humans to upskill ultimately. So if I wanted to think about what I hope my kids would do, or grandkids, is I do the opposite of discourage them from doing skilled trades. If you see that's where their appetites lie, there's a lot you can do, and you can always get a college degree, as we all know, online, as we all know, from some very reputable universities and colleges, after you've decided that you want to do that, and you've made a bunch of money as a nuclear qualified welder, because we're going to be short nuclear qualified welders. And those jobs will probably pay, well, today they probably pay $250,000 a year, and they'll be paying them more in the future because we're very short welders who know how to weld at the skill levels to build nuclear power plants.
Your book, Mark, was fairly optimistic and positive, and then you had an epilogue, and in the epilogue it was a little bit more, say, some realistic, where you're talking about what happens with bad governance, what happens if there's a war, and changing geopolitics, the demographic, we have a shrinking, I've done like 5 different podcasts on shrinking populations, which is going to be a real thing in, 2050s, if not before. And then you're also an energy expert. And we're seeing a lot of, not just in the U.S., with this massive push of renewables or quote unquote renewables, I guess. I mean, renewables obviously take a lot of minerals, and they bring
renewable.
Right. We're not renewable. I had Patrick Moore on podcast. But anyways, as you mentioned, we started this, or towards the beginning of this podcast, talking about all the energy that the cloud uses. Yeah, AI uses significantly more energy, but what are some things that would, are we going to have enough energy use to even build out all the complements of AI? Basically, I guess the question is, how realistic are we going to have your kind of more positive or optimistic versus some dystopian? I mean, all the science fiction movies obviously are dystopian, but I mean, I think they probably do that to get better views, but you kind of understand the question here. So just kind of go with it. Yeah.
Well, let's just start with dystopia first, because fiction is much more fun if it's dystopian. I mean, first, looking at history through the lens of the terrible things that happen is informative, and of course it's dramatic. Wars are the kind of drama we do movies about because they're horrific, dramatic, and they also expose the best and worst of human nature. It's the same for science fiction. Dystopia. There's a science fiction project that they undertook some years ago. They challenged, this is the University of Arizona, which has a science fiction degree program. They challenged some leading science fiction writers to write short stories that were optimistic. The future has to be optimistic, and they collected it in a book of short stories that are optimistic science fiction. They're very good, but it's hilarious. Even trying to be optimistic, they couldn't resist a lot of dystopian sort of threads through the optimism, because it makes the story better. Look, the big picture is, and I'll answer the question about AI and energy, because it's very relevant to the miasma, the pessimism that's run amok today, which is derived from the energy debates and the climate debates. That's why I put my epilogue about climate China, right, and culture, right? The social media destroying our kids. Is China going to take over the world? And is climate change the existential threat that's, we're just done, we're toast? You could probably guess I'm not in the camp that thinks there's anything apocalyptic happening from climate change. Stuff is happening, but we're great. We're great adapters. Human beings are great, incredibly resilient. Nature's been trying to kill humans forever. I began my health chapter on that point. Nature really wants to kill humans. And so we've spent all of history trying to tame nature without destroying it. We need nature. We're part of it, but we try to tame its predations. But there are clearly high risks. I mean, we can Sovietize an economy politically. We can overmanage it. We have to have government. That's one of the great inventions of humanity, is governance, self-governance. That we don't just chaotically try to exist. So government is an invention, right? Laws are an invention. It's a way of creating something called society. That's actually an invention. Animals have things we call societies, but they're not. They're sort of organic ways just to survive. We're trying to do more than just survive. Killing other things and taking their land. That's what humans have always done. So those are inventions, but humans are humans. So that's why I write in the epilogue that I don't expect that wars will end because we have better technology and we're wealthier. I hope that we'll continue to evolve to fewer wars, more contained wars, resolving it better, all these things, and crime, all the rest. But there's no point. You can look at all of human history. It's trended for 2,000 years towards both better societies, not perfect, not always better. We oscillates, but there's far less abject poverty in the world than there's ever been. There's far less slavery in the world than there was ever been. There's still slavery in the world. People have been enslaving each other through all of human history. It's far less of it. There's far less environmental destruction there's ever been. All these trends are macro trends. So I'm fundamentally optimistic that that's the long term. The problem is the short term. Our personal lifespans or the next 5-10 years of our lives, that we don't do really stupid things. And I'm not naive. Really stupid stuff can happen, but human nature has shown we tend to, especially in the United States, pull back to getting things done in a sensible way. We tend to, after fighting and arguing. So that's my macro view. It's not a provable thing. It's just what history has shown. But in terms of our specifics, I write that China has a much greater demographic problem than we do. And that would tell you, if you're a demographer, you've done your podcasts on this, that means the United States is in much better shape than China, just full stop. They've got a really big problem, which creates collateral problems in terms of geopolitics and potential for war. But we are the advantaged country globally. And this is not a jingoistic statement. We have the biggest economy. We still have a growing population, whether you're happy with illegal immigration or not. We have immigration, so we'll still have immigrants if we redound to more legal immigration. America's always been a melting pot since its founding. That's what we are. We fight over how to make that pot melt properly, which we're doing now, and we should. That's part of the governance. But that's the nature of what's going on at the fundamental level. We're growing in population, not shrinking. Our demographic collapse is slower, which means it's more likely to be reversible in a century or two than China's. I'm not saying it's going to reverse, but if I were guessing, it might. We're talking very long cycles. So if you think then about hyper-specific things, I write about energy in my book, the idea that we can and will transition away from using hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal, I just reject based on physics, engineering, economics, and history. We're not going to. We've never transitioned away from any energy source. Well, that's not true. We transitioned away from slavery as an energy source. We enslaved people to pull carts, and that we've left. We've transitioned away from whale oil. Thank God. But there's very few examples in human history. We haven't transitioned away from wood. Most people don't realize that today, the global contribution of energy from burning wood is triple the global contribution of energy from wind power and solar power combined. It's crazy, right? We're still burning more wood for energy than we are from all the world's solar panels and windmills combined. Doesn't mean that's the status quo. Wind and solar will triple and pass wood in the next decade. But think about how low a bar that is, passing wood. And that won't eliminate Oil, gas, and coal, there's no forecast that says that's going away. Growth rate's slow, but they're still growing because the magnitude of energy demand is so great, which brings us to compute. There's been a lot of writing and hype about energy demands of AI, but the truth is the energy demands of AI, which are great on a one-on-one basis. An AI chip uses roughly 10 times more electricity as it's operated compared to a compute chip. But that AI chips don't do everything. You don't use AI to replace everything. So the real energy consumption of the cloud is not the AI consumption. It's just the fact of the cloud itself, the communications, the memory, the transport of data, the conventional logic processors. AI is accelerating it. It's accelerating it for two reasons. Because it's inherently more energy intensive. So you can do the math. Like if 2% of my chips were AI chips in a data center, but they use 10 times more energy, then I'm going to get a 20% bump on energy demand. But the 80% is still the native compute, right? Secondly, AI makes the native compute more useful. So, for example, you need more data to run large language models, which means I need more memory chips and more energy to make them, more energy to transport the data and store it. So what AI does is accelerate the use of and construction of conventional compute. The analogy I've used before, which I think is easiest and closest to accurate, is that the conventional aviation by the late 1950s had been around for almost 35 years in widespread use, hundreds of aviation businesses, people traveling everywhere. But the late 1950s saw the invention of a viable commercial jet engine. Putting jet engines on an airframe caused a knee in the curve of the use of aviation. Putting AI into compute is the equivalent of putting jet engines on the airframe of an existing capacity in industry. We're at a knee in a curve. So the bottom line, I'll finish that rant with the observation. What does that mean for energy for compute? So what we have is a lot of data center and AI cognoscenti saying, well, admitting that we can't supply all the energy with wind and solar, and we cannot. It needs to be a lot of energy. It needs to be reliable. We're not building them fast enough, and they're not cheap enough, despite all the hype. Because to make them reliable, you have to build more of them, and you have to build lots of batteries at grid scale. And the math just doesn't work at those scales. I mean, we're talking country scales worth of electricity demand. Single data centers using more than twice the electricity of a steel mill. I mean, it's crazy numbers that we know are already real, not in theory. So what will happen was there's a resurrection of the affection for nuclear energy again. It was great. I'm a nuclear bull. I spent a lot of the years of my life in the nuclear industry. I've argued for nuclear energy for decades. I'm delighted we've now reanimated our appetite for that. But you can't order a nuclear plant to power a data center because we're not building any nuclear plants. Nor do we yet know how to build them at the scale we need for the small nukes that we're all talking about. So what has got going on is a lot of excitement to design those so we can build them. Terrific. But we're going to build, this is what the data shows, over the next 5 years, the number of data centers in total megawatts or square feet that are being added is equal to all the data centers that exist today. So we're going to double the capacity of the infrastructure in 5 years. Where's that power going to come from? Well, this is just, again, predicting what's already happened. It may not make everybody happy, but the answer in short is gas turbines. There'll be lots of other stuff. There'll be lots more windmills. There'll be people who borrow, steal electricity from the existing nuclear plants. We'll reactivate some nuclear plants that are shut down, I think and hope. What the rest of the world is doing is burning more coal, which doesn't make a lot of people happy, but that's what's going on. The number of coal plants being built is new pellets. It's at an unprecedented level in Asia. They're adding more coal plants to the world that exists globally, and certainly far more than exists in the United States, because they need the electricity, not just for data centers, but for aluminum making and for pharmaceuticals, because they're all growing. But back to the United States, I do not believe for a second that we're not going to build a data center because we can't get electricity. We will produce the electricity. We will produce it with the old adage, that all the above, but the anchor is going to be natural gas for a very simple reason. We have functionally an infinite supply of natural gas. It's crazy cheap. In oil equivalent terms, it's like $20, $10 to $20 a barrel oil equivalent. It's crazy, crazy cheap. And we're the world's largest producer, and we can produce it, function it at infinite volumes. And so all you need to do is build pipes and drill, which you can do in a year, not in a decade. So if you wanted to order a gas turbine and get new gas for it, you can talk in terms of, months, like 20 months, 18 months, 10 months in some cases. If you want to order a new nuclear plant, I'm stating the obvious. You're talking not years, you may be talking decades. So we can maybe accelerate it to a decade or two because we don't have the infrastructure and we haven't done it yet. The nuclear plants we know how to build, the Chinese are building, the Russians are building, by the way, and the French. We aren't yet. We started the industry, we created it. I'm hoping we'll, restore our leadership there. So all that redounds to long-term great. In short-term, I think the economic opportunity is overwhelming from expanding compute, AI, and data centers. So we'll see. They're already seeing this. So we'll call them political compromises. The solar and natural gas communities are not enemies. They're frenemies. They're actually partners because you can minimize the amount of additional gas turbines you need by using solar. Solar, by the way, is going to be an easier route than wind. Wind, we're sort of maxing out in terms of its economic utility. Solar, we haven't done that yet. So that's not a political statement. That's what should happen. I'm saying that's what's going to happen because it's the nature of what's possible. It's just where I do all my analysis and forecasting. You have to start with what's possible to build in the time frames we need things.
So, Mark, I just got kind of two final questions before you get out of here. In your book,
kick me out. It's okay. I'll go happily.
If I remember correctly, you said in the 20th century, for you, the most significant invention was the diesel engine.
Yeah.
And so let's say in 10 years from now, when we do a follow-up to this podcast in 2034, what will be the most significant invention of the 21st century?
Well, if we do it sort of analogously, because once you invent something that has high utility, it essentially never gets replaced. Diesel engines run the world. It's all and fundamentally an aircraft aeroderivative combustion turbine is a diesel engine. It burns diesel fuel. The reciprocating diesel engines move all ships, all big trucks, all mining gear. That changed the world. Just changed the world. And we're going to be using those engines for centuries, not for years or months, but for a long time. So you don't need to reinvent the diesel engine. You just keep making it better. So what's the equivalent of that? And so if you're being specific to the engine, not the machine it runs, whether it's a backhoe or a delivery truck or a dump truck or a pump, right? Then it's probably the AI engine, the inflection point. The GPU is realized was a tensor processing unit, doesn't matter. But the idea of instantiating nonlinear logic, machine learning into a silicon chip is as consequential as the diesel engine. And it took the diesel engine a couple decades to have its full realization, and it continued to grow. I think the compute chip will happen a little faster within this decade. You'll see small, just like diesel engines can be tiny and it can be big. AI is going to be embodied and embedded, already is. You make cameras smart natively because there's a lot of camera functions that end up being post-processed. If you feel like it have to be done later, you can do it in real time with AI embedded. That doesn't make it makes it, quote, smart, right, in that parlance, but it just makes it better. And I think that's what we'll see. If you were looking up one layer and you viewed the aircraft itself as a consequential invention of the 20th century, it sure was, right? Then what would the equivalent, or the car, is probably the most consequential invention of the 20th century. If you had to pick one machine, it sort of ranks up there with the electric generator in terms of unleashing human freedom and economic productivity. I'd say we'll end up saying that the untethered robot will be in that category for the 21st century. We'll have useful untethered robots as machines, but just like the car or the airplane were consequential machine inventions, unique, they required the derivative subsidiary inventions, right, of engines and combustion and all the other communications to make it safe and reliable. The same is going to be true of the AI chip or a robot. But that's sort of where we are. The one thing that's in my book that I say because we haven't got there yet, but synthetic genomics, synthetic biology, the ability to not print organs, cell tissue that's important to humans, but the idea of doing consequential synthetic biology, allowing us to grow, let's say, a replacement heart, using your genetic code to grow your replacement heart when you need it. When we've got that at commercial insertion, pre-commercial, then that will be seen, no question, as consequential as any invention at any time in history. But I didn't put that in my book. I put that as a part of my book, but I didn't emphasize it because I don't believe, I could be wrong, happy to be proven to be wrong in this, but I don't believe we'll see in the 2020s significant commercial insertion of synthetic biology. We're just on the early phases of that.
Today's guest has been Mark P. Mills, the author of the book, The Cloud Revolution, How the Convergence of New Technologies Will Unleash the Next Economic Boom and a Roaring 2020s. So yeah, just want to thank you, Mark, for joining us today. Just two final questions for you. One, where can people get a hold of your book, The Cloud Revolution? Where can people get a hold of you, find your other work, any information you want to share? And then after that, just let us know a final thought related to your book, related to something that you're working on currently, just what's on your mind.
Sure. Well, the book's at Amazon, like all books these days, so easy to find. The Cloud Revolution, Mark B. Mills. You can follow what I do both in my national center and other things at my website, which is tech-pundit.com, tech pundit with a hyphen. And, I'm running this new National Center of Energy Analytics, which just started, and we're engaging in the science, technology, and policy debates about energy. And you can sort of keep an eye on what we're doing, because we'll issue in the near future an update to the study you pointed out from 2013 called The Cloud Begins with Coal. Maybe I'll title the new report, The Cloud Begins with Natural Gas, get what I just said, or The Cloud Grows with Natural Gas, or so I want to revisit the energetics of the cloud and where things are going in a forthcoming study. And we'll be publishing a study every month or so in other areas, ranging from transportation to the future of pharmaceuticals and not just AI and compute, but aviation, shipping, how we manufacture things, chip fabs, the energetics of that. That's sort of the focus of the center.
And then just leave us with a final thought related to the cloud revolution, or just something else that you're working on, thinking about.
I think I would say in self-promotion that the book is as or more relevant now than it was when I was published 2 years ago and change, because the trends that I mapped out then are happening. And I think the fact that the 2 years that transpired validate the trends may give people reason to believe the other forecasts of the book. So promoting the reading of the book, of course.
Right. When you're researching this book, what was the most outrageous thing, or just the thing that stuck out to you as the actual author of this book that was most memorable?
I would say the one that struck you, finding printing of organs, was kind of fascinating. The one that was least surprising, but still fascinating, is what I think is the evolution on how we can and will educate broadly. The advent, not just of Zooming, but infusing AI into dynamic learning, so how you're taught adapts to you, your ability to learn, your circumstances. I think this is a really more consequential change for society than anything that we've seen in education for a long time, and a little bit of a surprise for me. I knew there was something there. I think there's something there more consequential than most people realize.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.